The wind reached Ashcombe Hollow before the rain did, a low complaint rolling down from the moor an hour before dusk, worrying at shutters, testing latches, sliding cold fingers under doors that had stood closed against far worse, and still did not entirely trust this one. By the time the church bell in the valley struck 5, the sky over the hills had gone the color of a bruise not yet healed, purple-black at the edges and sickly yellow at its heart, and every farmer, every drover, every soul with eyes to see and sense to use them had already turned for home, latched their gates, and settled in to wait it out. Smoke was beaten flat from the cottage chimneys the moment it rose. Somewhere down the lane a dog had begun to bark at nothing at all, the particular high, unhappy bark of an animal that knew, long before its master did, that the sky meant business. Every soul but one. Miss Cassandra Wren walked the flooding turnpike road, with a basket of medicines pressed against her ribs, her cloak soaked through at the shoulders, because old Mrs. Pruitt at the mill cottage had taken a fever 3 days past, and someone had to carry the willow bark tincture and the fresh linen before the road washed out entirely, and in the Wren household it had long since been settled without discussion that the someone would be Cassandra. She was 22, the eldest of 3 sisters, and she had stopped expecting, some years back, that anyone would notice whether she went out in weather like this, or whether she came home again whole. The wind pulled at her bonnet ribbons, until she gave up retying them, and simply held the whole thing down with one gloved hand, the basket clutched tighter with the other, her half-boots already soaked through, and her stockings clinging cold against her ankles. And still she walked on, because Mrs. Pruitt's fever would not wait upon fairer weather, and no one else in the house had ever once offered to go in her stead. She was not friendless, precisely. She was simply the girl the household ran on, the way a house runs on its foundation, necessary, unremarked, never once admired for holding the roof up. Her father, Mr. Edmund Wren, was a country solicitor of modest means and considerable pride, a man whose pride had outlived his fortune by a good 10 years, and who filled the difference with schemes that never quite paid, and debts that always quietly did. Cassandra's mother had died when Cassandra was 12, worn thin by years of managing a household on promises rather than money, and her father had remarried within 18 months, a widow named Mrs. Iris Colby, a woman of sharp features and sharper ambitions, who had brought with her a daughter of her own, Miss Priscilla Colby, fair-haired, quick to laugh, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from having been told, since infancy, that she was the pretty one. It was Priscilla who was sent to the dressmaker in Bath each spring, Priscilla whose new gowns arrived wrapped in tissue and were unwrapped at supper for the whole family to admire, while Cassandra's own gowns were turned and returned, until the seams themselves grew tired of holding. It was Priscilla whose accomplishments at the pianoforte were praised before supper guests, until the guests grew visibly weary of praising them back, while Cassandra's quieter gift, a genuine, patient skill with the sick and the frightened, learned at her own dying mother's bedside, went entirely unremarked, as though nursing a fevered tenant through the night were no more notable an accomplishment than sweeping a floor. And it was Cassandra who kept the household ledgers her father could not bear to look at, who nursed the sick tenants when the parish nurse was engaged elsewhere, who walked out in storms with baskets of medicine, because kindness, in that house, had become simply another chore assigned to the daughter no one thought to protect from the weather. She did not resent it. She had trained herself, with the same discipline she brought to everything, not to resent it, which was very nearly, though not quite, the same as not feeling it at all. On quiet nights mending by candlelight after the rest of the house had gone to bed, she sometimes allowed herself to wonder what it might be like to be looked at the way Priscilla was looked at, not for what she could do for someone, but simply for who she was, and then she would set the thought aside, briskly, the way she set aside every other indulgence that could not be afforded, and go on with her mending. The turnpike road bent sharply where it crossed Hallow Beck, the water already running high and brown beneath the old stone bridge, and it was there, a mile from the mill cottage and a good deal farther from home, that Cassandra heard it over the wind, not thunder, but a lower, wronger sound, the splintering groan of wood giving way and, beneath it, the high scream of a frightened horse. She left the road before she had properly decided to leave it, her half-boots sinking to the ankle in mud, gone to black soup, and came upon the wreck at the bottom of the embankment. A curricle overturned in the ditch beside the swollen beck, one wheel shattered to spokes and splinters, the horse tangled wild-eyed in its traces, and one hoof already dangerously near the rushing water, and beneath the overturned body of the carriage, a man's boot, and above the boot, silence, which frightened her a great deal more than screaming would have done. She did not know him. She did not pause to wonder who he might be, or whether helping him was a sensible thing for a woman alone to do on an empty road in a gathering storm. She saw only that a man was pinned and likely bleeding, and that the horse, in its terror, might drag the whole wreck, and the man beneath it, into the flooded beck within the minute. "Be still, now, be still," she told the horse, in the low, even voice she used on frightened creatures of every kind, and something in the steadiness of it reached the animal enough that she could catch the trailing rein and haul its head away from the water, bracing her boots in the mud, with her whole weight thrown against the terrified pull of it, until the horse quieted to a shivering, blowing stillness. Only then did she go to her knees beside the wreck. The man beneath the overturned seat was young, dark-haired, with a gash above his temple bleeding freely into the mud, and a fine grey coat of exceptional cloth torn nearly through at the shoulder. His eyes were closed. For one long, terrible moment she thought him dead, and something in her chest seized so hard it frightened her more than the storm had, and then his eyes opened, grey and unfocused, and fixed, with visible effort, on her face. "Can you move your legs, sir?" she asked, already working her hands beneath the shattered seat where it pinned his hip. "Tell me if there is a true break, and I will not try to move you at all. I will go for help instead, and leave you as you lie." "I can move them," he said through gritted teeth, and proved it, and between his own effort and the strength she had not known she possessed until she needed it, the weight came off him and he dragged himself free into the mud, breathing hard. One hand pressed to the bleeding gash at his temple. "You're bleeding badly," she said, and because she carried nothing better, she tore a long strip from the hem of her petticoat, already ruined by the mud, and pressed it to the wound, holding it firm until he winced, and she said, in the same tone she might have used on a frightened child, "I know. Hold still. It wants stitching, but not tonight, and not in this weather. Who are you?" He managed, and even wrecked and bleeding, his voice carried an unmistakable note of a man unused to being questioned rather than obeyed. "No one of any particular consequence," she said, which was, as far as she was concerned, entirely true, and there was no time to make more of it than that, for the rain had begun in earnest now, coming down in cold grey sheets, the light failing fast toward true dark. "There is a shepherd's cottage not a quarter-mile up the hollow. I've passed it 100 times carrying medicine to the mill. It stands empty this time of year, but it will keep the worst off us both. Can you stand, sir, if I bear some of your weight?" He could stand. Though it cost him a groan, he tried and failed to swallow, and together, his arms slung heavy across her shoulders, her own knees near buckling twice beneath him in the mud, they made the slow, staggering climb up the hollow track to the low stone cottage that stood, dark-windowed and silent, at the edge of what she took to be simply an empty tenant holding gone unused since. Michaelmas. The door, when she tried it, gave inward, unlocked as such cottages so often were. Inside there was one room, a cold hearth, a stack of dry peat left by some tenant farmer against the winter, and very little else. She got him onto the narrow bed frame along the wall, and set about the fire with the flint and steel she found on the mantel shelf, her fingers clumsy with cold, until at last the spark caught, and the small room began, by slow degrees, to fill with warmth and shifting orange light. "You did not have to trouble yourself so," the stranger said, watching her from the bed, his grey eyes following her hands as she coaxed the flame higher. "You'd have troubled someone, sooner or later, lying in a ditch in this weather," Cassandra said, without looking up. "I only happened to be the one who came along first. Any Christian soul would have done the same, would they?" he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not quite agreement, not quite a question, that made her glance up at him properly for the first time since the fire had caught, and found him watching her with an expression she could not entirely name. Something between astonishment and a very old, very careful weariness. She did not know, could not have known, kneeling there with soot on her hands and her hair coming loose in wet ropes from its pins, that the man she had pulled from the wreck was Alexander Vane, 7th Earl of Marchbrook, master of the very land she had crossed to reach him. A man who had been travelling the back roads in a hired curricle rather than his own crested carriage, precisely because he had grown, in these last 2 years since his father's death, thoroughly weary of being calculated rather than seen. He had inherited a title, an estate mortgaged nearly to its stones, and a mother whose social ambitions had not diminished one particle for the family's diminished fortune, and he had spent every season since being paraded, with excruciating politeness, before an unbroken line of young ladies whose mothers had already totaled his acreage, before the introductions were even finished. He had not, in a very long while, been helped by anyone who had not first troubled to learn who he was. It was, in truth, precisely why he had taken the back roads that afternoon at all, hired curricle and plain coat, and no groom in attendance, rather than send word ahead, as any sensible earl with a wrecked axle waiting to happen might have done. His mother had spent the whole of the spring season parading him, with relentless and exhausting cheer, before every marriageable young lady whose family could still be persuaded to overlook the state of the Marchbrook ledgers, and he had grown so tired of watching calculation move behind pretty eyes, the instant his title was mentioned, that he had taken, more and more often, to riding out alone under a plain name, if only to remember what it felt like to be spoken to as an ordinary man, rather than assessed as a ledger entry with a pleasant face attached. He had told himself it was folly. He had done it anyway, and now he lay bleeding in a ditch for his trouble, and found, absurdly, that he did not regret it in the least, because the woman kneeling over him in the mud had not once, in all the time it took to free him, so much as glanced at the cut of his ruined coat. He watched this mud-spattered young woman feed peat to his fire with the brisk, unhesitating competence of someone who had built 100 fires in 100 cold rooms and never once had a servant to do it for her, and something in his chest, some old guarded mechanism he had thought entirely rusted shut, turned over, slow and reluctant, like a key forced in a lock long unused. "What is your name?" he asked again, more gently this time. "Cassandra Wren," she said. "And yours?" He opened his mouth to answer honestly, and then, for reasons he could not have entirely explained even to himself, reasons that had a great deal to do with the plain uncalculating way she had asked, as though his answer might be Alexander the stable groom for all the difference it made to her, he said only, "Alexander, not my lord, not Marchbrook, only Alexander," as though he were any man dragged from a ditch by any woman with a steady hand and a torn petticoat. And something in the plainness of it felt to him, absurdly, like the first true breath he had drawn in above a year. Outside, the storm did not relent. If anything, it worsened, the wind finding every seam in the old stone walls, and by the time Cassandra had cleaned the gash at his temple with rainwater from the barrel outside the door, and bound it as best she could, full dark had come down entirely, and with it a wind so violent that when she tried the door to judge whether she might yet reach home before her family grew alarmed, it would not open against the weight of the gale. They were, in the plainest possible terms, trapped together for the night. "I cannot get out," she said, and heard, beneath her own carefully held composure, the first true thread of fear, not for herself alone, though that fear was real enough, but for what the morning would mean for her name, her family, and whatever small standing remained to a girl already overlooked in every drawing room she had ever entered. A young woman, unmarried and unchaperoned, discovered to have spent a full night alone with a strange gentleman in an empty cottage. There was no version of that truth, however innocent, that a country parish would receive as anything but ruin. Alexander, watching her face in the firelight, understood the shape of that fear before she gave it words, for he had grown up enough among the ton to know precisely how such things were weighed, and weighed always, always, against the woman. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. No harm will come to you through any fault of mine, he said quietly, and meant it with a fervor that surprised even himself. I give you my word on it, whatever that is worth to you tonight. Your word, Cassandra said, with a small, exhausted laugh that held no real bitterness in it, only fatigue, is a very great comfort, sir. But I do not think the parish will trouble itself to ask after your word. They will ask after my ruined petticoat and my loosened hair, and how many hours the two of us were shut in here together, and no true answer I give will satisfy them, because the question they mean to ask was never truly about the truth at all. He said nothing to that, because he knew she was entirely right. And because it was, he found, a rare thing indeed to hear a woman name the shape of her own possible ruin so plainly, without weeping over it, and without scheming to make some advantage of it either. She simply set the fact beside the fire and the storm, another feature of a very bad night, and went on doing what could be done, which was very little beyond keeping the flame alive and waiting out the dark. They passed the black hours in careful, decent distance, she upon a three-legged stool drawn near the hearth, with a horse blanket found folded in the corner drawn about her shoulders, he upon the narrow bed, neither sleeping much, both listening to the wind try the walls. For a long while neither spoke at all, the silence broken only by the settling of peat in the fire, and once by the distant complaint of the horse tethered under the cottage's lean-to-roof outside. Then, quietly, Alexander asked her about her family, and Cassandra found herself answering more honestly than she had answered anyone in a very long while, about her mother's death, about the ledgers she kept, and the sister who was praised for accomplishments Cassandra had never once been offered the leisure to learn herself, about the particular loneliness of being necessary to a household without ever being wanted by it. She did not mean to say so much. The dark and the fire and the stranger's steady, undemanding attention drew it out of her regardless. And when she caught herself and fell silent, embarrassed, he said only, "Go on. I find I would rather hear the whole of it than half," and so she did, and he listened as though every word of it mattered, which no one, in her whole remembered life, had ever quite troubled to do before. He watched her, in the shifting light, take a needle from the small housewife she carried in her cloak pocket, and mend a tear in her own sleeve, without complaint or comment, and he thought of his own great cold house 11 miles distant, its shuttered wing, its portraits of ancestors who had never once, he suspected, mended their own sleeves by firelight, while trapped with a stranger in a shepherd's cottage, and found himself, God help him, envying the plain competence of her hands, near what must have been 3 in the morning, when the wind had dropped to a low continuous moan, and the fire had burned down to a bed of orange coals. She said, without preamble, "You are not what you seem, Alexander." He went very still. "What do you mean by that?" "Your boots," she said. "They are exceedingly fine, beneath the mud, and you speak like a man accustomed to being obeyed, though you have spent the whole of this night trying rather hard not to sound it." She looked at him then, steady and entirely unafraid. "I do not ask because it signifies to me who you truly are. I ask because I think you are not accustomed to anyone asking you plainly, and I find that rather a sad thing for a man to carry about with him." It was, of that whole long night, the moment he would remember longest, not the fire, not the storm, not even the fear of the coming morning, but the plain unflinching kindness of a woman who had guessed correctly at his rank and found it a good deal less interesting than his loneliness. "I am an earl," he said at last. "Marchbrook, this land you are standing upon, this cottage, belongs to me. Though I confess, I did not think it worth mentioning while you were binding my head with your own petticoat and hauling my horse away from a flood by main strength. Cassandra's careful composure, held so long and so well, faltered only slightly, a widening of the eyes, swiftly mastered. Then, this is your cottage. It is, then, sir, she said, with the ghost of a tired laugh. I have gone and compromised an earl. I rather think, he said, and something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, only the shadow of one, the almost of it, that I have compromised you, Miss Wren, which is a very great deal more dangerous a thing for you than it will ever be for me. Dawn came grey and reluctant, the storm spent at last, the hollow track below the cottage a churned brown river, and it was into that grey morning that Mr. Edmund Wren rode, white-faced and thunderous, having discovered his eldest daughter's absence at first light and traced her, through the frightened mill-boy sent running with word that Miss Wren had never arrived with the medicine at all, to the last place anyone had seen her walking. He found the cottage door standing open to air the smoke, and within it his daughter, pale and sleepless but entirely, visibly untouched, and beside her a man whose ruined fine coat and unmistakable bearing told Mr. Wren everything and nothing at once. "What?" said Mr. Wren, in a voice gone dangerously and carefully quiet, "is the meaning of this?" Alexander rose to meet him without a trace of the previous night's guardedness, every inch the Earl now, despite the mud still drying stiff on his coat, and said, "The meaning, sir, is that your daughter pulled me from a wrecked curricle in a flooding storm with her own 2 hands, sheltered me at very considerable risk to her own good name, and has behaved throughout with a decency I have rarely encountered anywhere in London in 10 full years of looking. I am the Earl of Marchbrook, and I intend to marry her, with your consent or entirely without it, before this week is out." Cassandra's head came up sharply. "You need not. I know very well I need not," Alexander said, and turned from her father to her. And for the first time in the whole long night his voice lost every trace of its earlier caution, and became, simply, a man's voice. "I do not offer out of obligation, Miss Wren. I offer because I have not, in the whole of a very lonely 2 years, met a single soul who spoke to me the way you did last night, as though I were only a man, worth helping, because helping was the right thing to do, and for no other reason whatsoever. I find I have no wish to let that go, merely because the storm has passed us by." Mr. Wren, who had ridden out that morning, prepared to demand satisfaction of some ruined nobody, and instead found himself negotiating with one of the oldest titles in the county, recovered his composure with a speed that would have been comic had it not been so nakedly convenient. And by that very evening a special license had been sent for, and by Sunday, 3 days hence, with the vicar only too glad to oblige an earl, Cassandra Wren walked up the aisle of the small parish church, in a gown hastily let out from her stepsister's own wardrobe, and became, before the whole astonished congregation, Cassandra Vane, Countess of Marchbrook. Priscilla Colby watched the ceremony with a face gone the colour of curdled milk, for it had been Priscilla, all these years, who was meant to make the great match. Priscilla, whose beauty had been cultivated toward precisely such an outcome, by a mother who had never once doubted the outcome. And it was Cassandra, plain and overlooked, and mud-handed Cassandra, who had walked into a flooded ditch and walked out a countess. Mrs. Colby's congratulations at the wedding breakfast were so thickly iced with false warmth that Cassandra tasted the falseness in every syllable and said nothing of it, only thanked her stepmother with the same quiet, weary courtesy she had always shown, because old habits of restraint did not dissolve merely because her circumstances suddenly had. If Cassandra had imagined that marriage to an earl would mean the end of feeling unnoticed, the first weeks at Marchbrook Hall taught her otherwise, in a different key entirely. The house was vast and cold in its unused wings, staffed by servants long accustomed, across 2 grieving years, to a master who kept to 3 rooms and asked nothing of anyone. There was a housekeeper, Mrs. Adderley, a spare grey-haired woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who watched the new countess arrive with open and unhidden skepticism. She had seen, across long years of service, young brides married in haste for reasons a good deal less honourable than a flooded storm, and she reserved her judgment accordingly, waiting to be shown rather than told. On that first morning, Mrs. Adderley had presented the household ledgers with the flat, testing courtesy of a woman fully expecting to be waved away, and had been visibly startled when the new countess sat down at once, without ceremony, and began reading through the accounts line by line, asking sensible questions about the dairy yield and the coal allowance, rather than simply nodding and handing the book back unread, as the housekeeper had privately wagered she would. It was a small thing. Mrs. Adderley said nothing of it at the time, but she remembered it, and filed it away, the way a careful woman files away every small proof, for or against, before she commits her loyalty to anyone. But Cassandra did what she had always done, which was to work. She learned the servants' names within the week, not merely the upper staff, but the scullery maids, the boot boy, and the elderly head gardener, who had let the old orangery fall to ruin, because no one had asked him to keep it otherwise in above 2 years. She found that glass-roofed room herself, its panes fogged grey with neglect, its beds gone entirely to weed and bramble, and she began, with her own 2 hands as much as any hired labourers, to clear it, because it reminded her, she told Mrs. Adderley one afternoon, of the one bright room of her own childhood home before her mother died, and she could not bear to see such a room left to rot when a little steady care would restore it. His late intended kept that orangery, Mrs. Adderley said one afternoon, watching the countess on her knees among the broken pots, dirt to her elbows. Miss Alcott. She died of a putrid fever, near 2 years since, a bare month before the wedding was to be held. His lordship has not set foot in that room since the day she was buried. Cassandra sat back on her heels. Then perhaps I ought to leave it be, and find some other occupation for my hands. Perhaps, said Mrs. Adderley, and something in her sharp, guarded face softened by the smallest fraction. Or perhaps a room ought not to stand a tomb forever, my lady, merely because someone once loved it dearly. I have come to think, though it is not my place to think it aloud, that his lordship has been waiting these 2 years for someone to tell him he was permitted to be happy again. It was the nearest thing to an endorsement Mrs. Adderley had yet offered anyone, and Cassandra took it as such, and went on with her work. Alexander, for his part, found himself drawn to the orangery in the evenings, ostensibly to inspect his wife's progress, in truth because he could not keep himself away from the sight of her there. Sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair coming loose from its pins, entirely unconcerned with how she appeared, wholly absorbed in coaxing green life back into a room he had shut away with his own grief. He remembered, the first evening he found her there at dusk, that she had brought a tray of tea unbidden to his study door that very afternoon, set it down without a word or a servant sent in her place, because Mrs. Adderley had mentioned that his lordship often worked past supper and forgot to eat entirely, and the plainness of that small gesture, no maid dispatched with a curtsy, but the countess herself, quietly, expecting no thanks whatsoever, had undone something in him he had believed sealed shut for good. There were other small things, in those middle weeks, that neither of them remarked upon aloud, but both of them noticed all the same. Cassandra found the household's dinner hour had long since drifted to whatever time suited the kitchen rather than the family, and without announcing any grand reform, she simply began asking Mrs. Adderley, each morning, what his lordship's schedule was likely to permit, and arranged the table accordingly. So that for the first time in 2 years Alexander found himself sitting down to a meal that was actually hot, at an hour he could actually keep, without ever having asked for the courtesy at all. She learned, from the old gardener, which of the estate's tenant families were behind on their rents not from idleness, but from a bad harvest and a worse winter, and quietly brought the matter to Alexander, not as a plea, but as a ledger, laid open upon his study desk with the figures already totaled in her own careful hand, so that he need only say yes or no, rather than untangle the accounts himself. A kindness so practical and so entirely without self-congratulation that he found himself staring at the page a full minute before he trusted his own voice too. Thank her for it. She reorganized nothing that was not broken, changed nothing that did not want changing, and yet the house, room by room, began to feel inhabited in a way it had not felt since before his father's death. A shawl left folded over the back of a chair in the small parlor where she liked to sit with her mending of an evening. Fresh flowers cut from the recovering orangery and set without comment in the front hall, the library fire laid and lit before he ever asked for it, because she had noticed, without being told, that he read there most nights past midnight, and had been doing so, cold, for longer than he cared to admit. None of it was declared. None of it was meant to be noticed. And that, Alexander thought, watching her hands at some small task or other, nearly every evening now, was precisely why he noticed every single instance of it. He did not speak to her of Miss Alcott's portrait, which still hung in the long gallery, nor did Cassandra ask him to have it removed, though she passed beneath it daily. One evening, finding him standing before it in the fading light, his face unreadable, she came to stand quietly beside him, not touching him, only present. She was very lovely, Cassandra said. She was, Alexander said. I loved her, once, in the way a young man loves, brightly, and without much wisdom to season it. He was quiet a long moment. I do not think loving you requires that I stop having loved her. I only know that for 2 years I believed the house had to stay dark to properly honor what I had lost, and you have shown me that a room may hold grief and still, somehow, grow roses. Cassandra said nothing to that, only slipped her hand into his, and they stood before the portrait together in the failing light. And it was, though neither of them named it aloud, the exact moment their marriage of convenience quietly, irrevocably, became something else entirely. It could not, of course, remain so simple, for they were still the Earl and Countess of Marchbrook, and London society, when the season drew them up to town that spring, had a great many opinions of its own about an earl who had married. In 3 days' unseemly haste, a country solicitor's overlooked daughter, found, of all things, in a shepherd's cottage during a storm. Chief among the opinionated was Lady Beatrice Fenwick, a widow of considerable fortune and a good deal more ambition, who had spent the better part of 2 seasons positioning herself, with patient and unrelenting purpose, as Marchbrook's next countess, and had watched that entire long campaign collapse in a single wet Tuesday she had not even been present to witness. She had, by her own careful reckoning, done everything correctly, had cultivated Alexander's mother's favor across 2 full seasons, had ensured her name was mentioned in the same breath as his at every gathering that mattered, had waited with the patient confidence of a woman who believed rank and persistence must eventually be rewarded, and to lose the prize at last not to a rival of her own standing, but to an unknown country solicitor's daughter, discovered in a shepherd's cottage of all unlikely places, struck her as nothing short of an insult to the whole natural order of things. Lady Fenwick was not a woman who wept over lost prospects. She made war upon them, with the particular elegant cruelty of a woman who understood perfectly well that in the ton, a well-placed whisper does far more lasting damage than any blade ever could. It began small, a remark at a card party about the new countess's country manners. A laugh not quite hidden behind a fan, when Cassandra mispronounced a French phrase she had simply never had occasion to learn. Lady Fenwick was too practiced a strategist to strike hard at the outset. She understood, better than most, that a reputation was not toppled with a single blow, but worn away, like a riverbank, by patient and repeated erosion. She made a point of seeking Cassandra out at every gathering, all warm smiles and solicitous questions, only to repeat, days later, some private confidence twisted just enough in the retelling to sound like vanity, or ignorance, or worse. At a musical evening at Lady Torrington's townhouse, she asked, in a voice calibrated to carry 3 seats in every direction, Whether it was true that the new Countess of Marchbrook had once nursed tenant families through fever herself, with her own hands, like a common apothecary's girl, how very useful an accomplishment, though one wonders what other households she has practiced her nursing upon, and to what particular end. At a card party in Grosvenor Square she remarked, apropos of nothing, that she had always found it remarkable how swiftly some young women managed to secure an offer, as though the whole business had been rehearsed beforehand, rather than left to chance, and let the sentence hang in the air for others to finish as they liked. Each remark alone was nothing, a stray unkindness, easily overlooked. Woven together across a season, they formed a pattern, and by midsummer, Lady Fenwick had constructed, thread by patient thread, a rumour that the Earl's sudden marriage had not been the product of chance and storm at all, but of a deliberate and calculated trap, that Miss Wren, as she insisted on still calling her in every telling, had somehow arranged the entire accident, had perhaps even tampered with the curricle wheel herself, in a scheme to entrap a peer and drag his fortune down to prop up her father's own quiet debts. It was, Cassandra realized with a sick lurch, when the whispered version first reached her through a supposed friend's careless mouth, a lie built from just enough plausible fact. Her father's debts were, after all, entirely real, and no secret at all, to be believed by anyone already inclined toward believing it, and in London that season, a great many were so inclined, for it made a far more entertaining tale than the plain, dull truth of a woman who had simply stopped on a dark road to help a stranger she took, at the time, for nothing more than an injured groom. Alexander watched his wife endure the slow accumulation of cold shoulders and colder smiles with a fury that built in him like a held breath, and it was Mrs. Adderley's steady, grandmotherly wisdom, sent up from the country by letter when word of the trouble reached her, that steadied Cassandra most through those long weeks. Write nothing, deny nothing publicly. Hold your head exactly as you always have, my lady. The truth needs no defending until the very moment it is attacked outright, and when that moment comes, let his lordship do what a husband ought to do. There were nights, in those difficult weeks, when Cassandra sat before her looking-glass, long after the maid had gone, turning over in her mind every cold glance and half-heard whisper of the day, wondering whether she had brought this trouble down upon them both by ever having left the turnpike road at all. It was on one such night that Alexander found her, still dressed, staring at nothing in particular, and rather than offer the easy reassurances a lesser man might have reached for, he simply drew a chair beside hers and sat with her in silence a long while, until at last he said, "I would rather stand beside you through every whisper London can invent than have spent one more year alone in a house with no fire in it. Whatever this costs us, Cassandra, I do not count it too high a price for what I have gained." It was not a grand speech. He did not mean it as one, but she carried the plainness of it with her through every difficult evening that followed. The way one carries a small stone in a pocket, worn smooth from handling, for comfort more than use. Cassandra had known, walking up the steps of Aldgate House that evening in a gown the color of pale champagne, that something was different in the air. She had felt it in the way conversations paused a half-beat too long as she passed, in the way fans lifted just slightly higher than they needed to, in the particular quality of Lady Fenwick's smile across the receiving line, too warm, too ready, the smile of a woman who has already chosen her hour and is merely waiting for the clock to strike it. Alexander had felt it too, and had kept close to her side through the first two dances, his hand steady at the small of her back. Though neither of them spoke of what they both plainly sensed gathering, the way one does not speak of a storm cloud directly overhead, for fear of hastening the rain. That moment came at Lady Aldegate's ball, in late July, before nearly 300 of the first families in England. Lady Fenwick had chosen her venue with the greatest of care. She waited until the dancing had paused, and a natural crowd had gathered near the refreshment room, where Cassandra stood with a glass of ratafia she had not yet found the heart to taste, and there, in a voice pitched to carry precisely as far as she intended it to carry, she said, "I confess I find it truly remarkable, my lady, How very conveniently that caracal wheel came to grief so near your own father's land. One almost wonders whether Providence had any true hand in the matter at all, or whether some rather more earthly agent arranged things a good deal more directly. The room went very quiet, the particular hushed quiet of an audience that has scented blood at last. Cassandra felt every eye in the room turn toward her, felt the old childhood instinct rise up to meet it, to lower her gaze, to say nothing at all, to let the insult pass unanswered, because objecting had never once, in her whole experience, changed a single outcome. But she thought of the cold cottage, of the fire she had built with her own numb hands, of a man who had chosen to give his true name to no one of consequence, simply because she had asked without any calculation at all in her face, and she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she was no longer entirely the girl who had once carried medicine baskets in obedient silence. I arranged nothing whatsoever, Lady Fenwick. Save the fire that kept a stranger from taking a chill in the night, Cassandra said, her voice steady and carrying, though her heart hammered hard beneath her stays. If you believe otherwise, I invite you most sincerely to ask the wheelwright who examined that broken axle the very next morning and pronounced it rotted plainly through with age and old weather. I did not tamper with any wheel to catch myself an earl, madam. I stopped upon a flooded road because a man lay hurt in a ditch, and I should have done precisely the same had he been nothing more than a passing groom. How very convenient, Lady Fenwick said, with a smile that did not reach anywhere near her eyes, that a solicitor's daughter should be so very certain of the difference. It was Alexander's turn then, and he had crossed the room before the last word had properly left Lady Fenwick's mouth, and he did not raise his voice at all, because he had no need to. A man of his rank rarely does, when he chooses to speak in a room gone entirely silent. I will say this once, and I trust it shall travel exactly as far as every whisper that has come before it, Alexander said, his grey eyes moving slowly over the assembled company with a coldness few present had ever before seen him direct at anyone in a ballroom. My wife pulled me from a wrecked curricle with her own 2 hands, in a flood that very nearly killed us both, and she asked nothing whatsoever of me in return for it, not my name, not my rank, not 1 farthing of my fortune. She built a fire with her own numb fingers. She bound my wound with her own petticoat. She spoke to me the entire night, as though I were merely an ordinary man deserving of ordinary kindness, which I had not, in fact, been offered by a single living soul in this room in a very long while. I chose her, Lady Fenwick, not despite her want of consequence, but precisely because she carries more true character in her smallest finger than half the fortune hunters who have smiled so prettily at me across ballrooms these 10 years past. Quite certain I would never notice the calculation sitting behind the smile. I noticed yours, madam, from the very first evening we ever met. I did not choose you. I chose the woman who chose, entirely of her own free will, to help a stranger for no reward at all. If that offends the ton's particular sense of how these matters ought properly to be arranged, then I find I have grown remarkably, and permanently, indifferent to the ton's opinion of me. The silence that followed was total, and then, from somewhere near the door, an elderly dowager, Lady Aldgate herself, in fact whose ball it was, and who had watched the entire exchange with sharp and unconcealed delight, began, quite deliberately, to applaud, and the sound spread, uncertain at first and then general, until Lady Beatrice Fenwick stood entirely alone and unclapped in the very middle of a room that had, in the space of perhaps 2 minutes, reversed its verdict completely. She left London within the fortnight, and was not, by general report, much missed by anyone at all. Cassandra did not remember, afterward, precisely how she came to be standing in her husband's arms, in an alcove just off the ballroom, only that she was there, and that he held her as though the storm that had first brought them together might yet return that very night, and he meant to shelter her from it with his own body, if it dared. You did not have to defend me quite so publicly, she said against his coat, her voice unsteady with the aftermath of fear, and something a good deal warmer besides. I had every need to, he said. I have spent 2 full years letting a house and a title stand between myself and anything resembling a true life, and you built a fire in a cold, empty cottage and gave me one back again, asking nothing whatsoever in return. I will defend that gift in every ballroom in England if I must, Cassandra. I love you. Not the Countess. Not the story London wishes so badly to make of you. You, plain-spoken, mud-handed, entirely unimpressed by my rank from the very first hour we ever met. I was not unimpressed, Cassandra said, with the ghost of a laugh through unshed tears. I was only a good deal more concerned with your bleeding head than with your title that first night. That, Alexander said, and this time the almost smile became, for the first time in 2 long years, something that was not almost at all, is precisely why I love you as I do. The summer that followed was, by any account Cassandra might have given, the happiest of her whole life. The orangery bloomed in true earnest by August, roses climbing at last over the restored trellises that had stood bare and broken for years past, and it became her habit, and then their shared habit, to take tea there each evening among the green, growing things she had coaxed back to life with her own 2 hands. Mr. Wren, sensing which way the wind now blow, made a great show of pride in his daughter's sudden elevation, though Cassandra received his warmth with the same wary courtesy she had always shown him, neither forgiving entirely what could not quite be forgiven, nor withholding what small grace she could still afford to give. Priscilla, to her credit, wrote once, stiffly, to offer congratulations that Cassandra chose, quite deliberately, to receive as sincere, because bitterness, she had long since decided, cost a great deal more to carry forward than it was ever truly worth. Time, as it does, moved steadily on. The scandal Lady Fenwick had labored so carefully to build collapsed entirely under the weight of its own discredited motive, and within a year the story told in London's drawing rooms was no longer of a scheming nobody who had trapped an earl, but of the storm-born romance of the Earl and Countess of Marchbrook, embroidered now with rather more flattering invention than the plain truth had ever strictly required, though Cassandra found she did not much mind which version society chose to believe, so long as the truth of her own heart remained entirely untouched by any of it. Mrs. Adderley, for her part, had watched the whole affair unfold from the country, with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose careful judgment had at last been thoroughly vindicated. When Cassandra returned to Marchbrook Hall that autumn, the housekeeper met her at the door, not with the guarded courtesy of those first weeks, but with something nearer to open warmth, and pressed into her hands, without a word of explanation needed, a small bundle of cuttings taken from the orangery's first roses, wrapped carefully in damp cloth for the long carriage journey, in case my lady wished to see whether they might take root in the London garden as well as they had taken root here. It was, Cassandra understood perfectly well, not really about the roses at all, and she thanked the old housekeeper with rather more feeling than the gift alone would seem to warrant, and Mrs. Adderley, unaccustomed to being thanked so plainly for anything, found urgent business elsewhere in the hall rather than answer. A year turned, near enough, to the very week of that first storm, and Marchbrook Hall in high summer bore almost no resemblance whatsoever to the shuttered, grieving house Cassandra had first walked into as a bride of hasty convenience. The orangery had become, by then, the pride of the whole county, its roses climbing riotous over restored glass, and it was there, on a warm evening with the last gold light slanting low through the panes, that Alexander found his wife with their small daughter, not yet 3 months old, dark-haired like her father, though she had, everyone agreed, her mother's own steady grey eyes, sleeping soundly against her shoulder. Mrs. Adderley tells me the succession beds have never borne such a crop of late peaches, Alexander said, settling beside her on the wrought iron bench that had long since replaced the broken one she had first knelt beside. Mrs. Adderley exaggerates rather fondly, now that she has finally decided to approve of me, Cassandra said, smiling down at the sleeping child. It took her the better part of 6 full months to come round. She is not alone in that particular education, Alexander said. I recall a certain cold cottage, and a woman who called herself no one of any consequence. I still am no one of any particular consequence, Cassandra said. I only happen to be married to someone who is. You are the whole of my consequence, Alexander said, and reached out to trace, very gently, the small rosebud embroidered along the edge of their daughter's christening blanket, a design Cassandra had stitched herself, its pattern taken, she had told him privately, from the very first bloom to open in the restored orangery the autumn after their wedding, so that the flower which had marked the healing of the house might mark too the child who had come at last to fill it with laughter it had not known in years. A rose for the cottage, Alexander murmured, and a rose for the girl who rebuilt everything it had long since forgotten how to hold. Cassandra leaned her head against his shoulder, the scent of roses and warm summer air settling over them both, and thought that if anyone had told her, on that flooded turnpike road a year past, carrying medicine no one had ever thought to thank her for, that she would come to sit here, a countess, a mother, loved plainly and entirely by a man who had once been only a stranger bleeding in a ditch, she would not have believed a single word of it. She thought, too, of her sister Priscilla's stiff letter of congratulations, and found she bore it no ill will at all, of her father's sudden, convenient warmth, received now with the same careful courtesy she had always shown him, neither more nor less, of Mrs. Adderley's rose cuttings wrapped so carefully for their long journey, and of Lady Fenwick's name, which she had not heard spoken in above 6 months, and did not particularly miss hearing. Every hard thing that had come before had, in its own strange fashion, led here, to this warm room full of green growing things and small quiet happiness, and she found she could hold the whole of it, the mud and the storm and the whispered cruelties, and the fire she had built with her own cold hands, without any of it weighing on her at all any longer. For the storm that had once seemed the cruelest turn of that whole grey, ruined afternoon had proved, in the end, to be the very door through which her true life had walked quietly in. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.